Alright, I may have gotten a little crazy with the Dark Ages thing, but it's important. It is extremely important to understand how messed up our current chronology is. Like, I can't stress it enough. And it affects everybody. I mean, this isn't like just some schizo ranting stuff to where you can just ignore it and, you know, whatever. Even if it's true, you can just ignore it. You cannot ignore this. The fact that the Dark Ages never existed, but it is pushed on the entire Western population as if it is an established fact. I mean, this is essentially, I mean, it's a crime against humanity in all honesty. I mean, to lie about history at this scale, right, and to put as much resources behind the lie as they have, I mean, it's insane. Like, it's a literal attack. This is not an accident. This is not like an accidental mistake made, you know, by the chronologists or the historians or governments or whatever. It's a literal attack on you personally. There are people on this planet that are purposefully playing you as a fool. All right. I want to scale some of this back. All right, so far in this series, I've shown everything I've shown so far is backed up by science and real archaeology and real history. I'm not speculating. Everything that's been in this series so far is based on science. That's it. If it's not scientific, then I didn't show it. Now, I want to reiterate all of that because it's important to realize that the stuff that I am showing you is real. This is not some weird conspiracy crap that, you know, I dug up out of nowhere. This stuff that I am showing you guys is a culmination of a lot of people's hard work to try to fight against an establishment that does not have your best interest in mind. All right, okay, I know I keep going off about that stuff. So here's the deal. Being immediately thrown into like the deep end of the pool of the whole Dark Age situation is kind of what I've done. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit. Now, there's been tons of scholarship, by the way, with respect to proving that the Dark Ages never existed, right? This is not a new phenomena, and I've covered this. This has been going on for a long time, right? You know, Isaac Newton wrote more about chronology and the problems of chronology than he did at all with respect to gravity. That means something, all right? So if you're skeptical about this, that's fantastic, but you also have to, at some point in time, look at the real evidence and take it for what it is and not what you've been trained to take it as. So this is what I want to do. For those of you who are still chilling over there at the shallow end of the Dark Age pool, or those of you who are still sitting, you know, you're still out of the water, maybe you want to dip your toe in there, but you're just not sure. What I want to do is I would like to scale back some of the evidence and bring it more to a middle ground. And before we go further, showing you more of the extreme evidence that just absolutely wipes the Dark Ages out of chronology. Because one of the things that I have a hard time remembering sometimes is that this stuff takes time, right? If you're in the Western world, if you've been classically trained on the Western side of things, you know, we have all gone through some tremendous psychological conditioning from so many directions. I mean, it's insane, right? And this stuff is not easily broken, and unfortunately, it takes time. But it can be broken, and you can move on, right? So that's why I always say use critical thinking skills and use your common sense, because those two skills right there, I mean, that changes everything if you objectively employ them. So here's what I would like to do. I'm going to read a paper from Dr. Hans-Ulrich Niemitz. And what he does, his premise is, he's more on the conservative side of chronology. He's more on the conservative side on what has been added to the Dark Ages. It's interesting. You see a lot. One of the things I always see in papers when I read, especially the higher up you go in academia or whatever, you can find people doing really good work calling out the BS, right? They're calling out the garbage, but they have to be careful when they do it. And in a lot of these papers, as they start to dig through the paper and you watch this dude or dudette read this stuff, you know, you start to see them crack and crumble as they realize that everything that they've been led to believe is wrong according to their own research, right? And this is what this is what happens a lot in higher level academia. Seriously, go read papers. It's hilarious. It's some of the funniest stuff you'll read, actually, is to watch an academic crack and break down as they realize their world vision, their world view is now invalid by their own research. Anyway, so this is a paper entitled, "Did the Early Middle Ages Really Exist?" Now, like I said, this paper is going to take a more conservative approach about how it deals with a chronological error of about 300 years. And the error that he discusses takes place like right in the middle, sort of where the Dark Ages is taking place. So don't forget, the Dark Ages is arguably between, like, you know, the second, third, I think you can go to the fourth-ish century, all the way up to like the, you know, between 1000, 1100, up to about 1300. And I give those dates because I have not seen a single scholar really pin down any of those dates. And how could they, right? One of the reasons why they're not able to, you know, pin down those exact dates is because the dating system that we use now was not being used back then, right? And there's a reason why. I mean, the people back in the Dark Ages, you know, the turn of the millennia, right? 0 AD or whatever, or 1 AD, you know, those people were coming out of a time that had been hit by a severe cataclysm only 500 or 600-ish years before that had literally reset quite a bunch of stuff. To make matters worse, another cataclysm was on its way. But that's not for this show right now. Yes, I realize I'm babbling, get on with the paper, but I want to set the stage for those of you who are maybe not all that familiar with the Dark Ages. I mean, I didn't really get into this stuff until about 4 or 5 years ago myself, when I had no choice but to get into it because all of my research was starting to contradict everything that the mainstream was saying. So I had to start looking into it. Yeah, and sure enough, man, not only, you know, will objective research start to destroy the Dark Age concept, but what'll also happen is, as you start to get into it, you start to immediately realize that you are not the first person with the problem. Which is good, because that means we have a lot of great people that came before us, which have done tremendous amounts of scholarship, really good scholarship, that then can help us move things forward, all right? Now, with an open and clear mind, and with an eye for the objective use of the scientific method, right? And we will follow the evidence wherever it takes us. And we will stay objective. We are not going to be biased. So it's incredibly important to remember that while you listen to this paper. All right, let's get to it.
Did the Early Middle Ages Really Exist? By Dr. Hans-Ulrich Niemitz.
Did the Early Middle Ages really exist? This question in itself, and more so the answer, no, the Middle Ages did not exist, is surprising to say the least. It contradicts all basic knowledge and attacks the historian's self-respect to such an extreme that the reader of this paper is asked to be patient, benevolent, and open to radically new ideas. I shall argue step by step, and I hope you will follow. With a group of friends, and he lists a bunch of them, I have been doing research on this subject since 1990. This is the reason for using we or I intermittently. The thesis mainly says, with far-reaching implications and consequences, between antiquity 1 AD and the Renaissance 1500 AD, historians count approximately 300 years too many in their chronology. In other words, the Roman Emperor Augustus really lived 1700 years ago instead of the conventionally assumed 2000. However, the whole well-known historiography of the Middle Ages contradicts this assertion. The easiest way to understand doubts about the accepted chronology and well-known history is to seriously systematize the problems of medieval research. This will lead us to detect a pattern which proves my thesis and gives reason to assume that a phantom period of approximately 300 years has been inserted between 600 AD to 900 AD, either by accident, by misinterpretation of documents, or by the deliberate falsification. This period and all events that are supposed to have happened therein never existed. Buildings and artifacts ascribed to this period really belong to other periods. To prove this, the Carolingian chapel at Aachen will serve as the first example. Yeah, interesting. So I actually already brought up this example in an earlier episode. So yeah, I mean, well, this is great, right? So this is just more people seeing the obvious. All right, cool. Let's keep going. Art historians explain and describe artifacts and buildings of this period as anachronistic, but they never follow up on their assessments. One of the best examples, intensively surveyed, is the Chapel of Aachen, ca. 800 AD, which seems to come approximately 200 years too early. The way of constructing an arch shown in this chapel has no predecessor. Arch aisles are usually only in the 11th century in Speyer. The construction of cores with rising arch and also rising barrel vaulting is not assumed until 200 years later at the Portal of Tournus. The vertical steepness of the interior arches of the Aachen Chapel is more accentuated than those of the churches built 2 centuries later. One of these is the 1049 AD consecrated abbey church of Ottomarschheim. Although missing some details of the earlier model, nevertheless it is the best copy, quote unquote, of Achaean. However, these and many other arguments implicate that the Chapel of Aachen has to be regarded as a building of the second part of the 11th century. Another big research problem is the AD way of counting years. How could 300 phantom years have crept into the accepted chronology, and why didn't anyone notice it? For approximately 2,000 years, people have been counting years correctly, haven't they? And of course, we now know they have not. Sorry, I will continue. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII started the so-called Gregorian calendar, which is basically a corrected version of the old Julian calendar of Julius Caesar. The Julian calendar, after being used for a long time, no longer corresponded with the astronomical situation. The difference, according to the calculations by Pope Gregory, amounted to 10 days. Now please calculate, how many Julian years does it take to produce an error of 10 days? The answer is 1,257 years. The question, at which date was the Julian calendar correct, can be calculated with the following amazing result. 1582 minus 1257 equals 325. In parentheses here they have the year in which the Gregorian calendar began minus the years necessary to produce 10 days of error in the Julian calendar equals the beginning of the Julian calendar. It seems, unbelievably, that Caesar introduced his calendar in 325 AD. This is unbelievable because by then he had already been dead for more than 300 years. If 16 centuries had passed since Caesar's introduction of his calendar, the Julian calendar in Gregory's time would have been out of sync with the astronomical situation by 13 days, not 10. Some historians have noticed this contradiction, but they solve it in this way. The scholars in Caesar's time reckoned a different date for the equinox, the day in spring where day and night have the same length. Yet it can be proved that the Romans used the same date for the same equinox as we do today, the 21st of March. For those of you out there who still subscribe hardcore, to the mainstream chronology, this statement right here is weird in and of itself. Why would they use a different date for the equinox? Right? That doesn't even make sense. The equinox is the equinox. And by this point in time in our history, it had settled down to this date. So the excuse of using a differently dated equinox is at first dumb. It's ridiculous. Why would you even say that? But then if you want to go a step further with Cope, what you can do is you can be like, well, I mean, ancient cultures, before the Romans, they did have a different date for the equinox. And this is true. Now, what you should be asking yourself, though, is why is this true? I mean, the equinox is the equinox. There is no reason for it to be on any other date. The date of the equinox is the date of the equinox. And we know for a fact that, the ancient cultures up to a certain point in time as we go back, they had no problem locking in the date of the equinox. They certainly had no problem locking in the date of the equinox before the Middle Ages. There was no problem. And cultures all over the world did this. Basically, what this starts to show us is the cracks in the logic that the mainstream has for defending, certain years like the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages or whatever we're talking about. But the amount of hypocrisy really starts to show itself. And this paper, I think, will go over it. All right, let's keep going. If our thesis of 300 phantom years is right, then the thesis must also be valid for the whole of Eurasian African history for the period between 600 AD and 900 AD. In this time period, Byzantium and the new Islamic realms were supposedly fighting each other in the Near East and the Mediterranean. Let us look at Byzantium first. Historians acknowledge a special problem for exactly this period. When did the empire reform its administration? When and how did this reform, called by modern historians reform of the themes, come into being? How did feudalism develop? One group of historians pointed out that the essentials for this reform were outlined in antiquity, and that for the 300 years following 600 AD, nothing happened. Thus, nothing can be said about this period because no historical sources exist for the supposed reform in this period. Unbelievable. That is literally what the mainstream believes. It's just... Okay. Another group interpolates between the years 600 AD and 900 AD a very slow evolution of Byzantine society. This evolution was so slow, they say, that the actors themselves hardly noticed it, and thus this evolution didn't produce any written documents. No archaeological remains either, by the way. Now that's the paper saying this. That's the problem with the Dark Ages. I know we're just talking about the Middle Age situation here, but that is the whole problem. There is zero evidence for this stuff, and the mainstream believes it. I mean, if you are still on board with the Dark Ages, you have got to explain this stuff. I mean, look at how... Okay, all right. I know I keep talking. All right. The discussion of both groups is termed the debate of continuity. The gap has to be filled by speculation. Therefore, both groups accuse each other of misinterpreting historical sources in an anachronistic manner. That's funny. That's the other thing people don't really really realize about mainstream stuff, like mainstream chronology and the way things are set up. Even, mainstream people don't agree with each other. You'll often get, one side of the story which is propagated by whichever side has the most power to propagate that side, right? And so that's what you get, and that's what gets drilled into most people's head. But it's funny, even at the mainstream level, they're still arguing. There's still 2 points of just stupidity fighting each other. You're just hearing one stupid side, right? If you were true to the scientific method, you would at least know both of the dumb sides, right? And then, of course, once you see both dumb sides, you can then call out the garbage. Moving on. U Topper and Manfred Zeller, those are names. U-W-E is a name? Like U? Okay. And Manfred? Man, who names their kids this? All right. Manfred Zeller and U Topper pointed out how to resolve some important riddles and research problems of the Islamic and Persian Arab Byzantine world using the thesis of the Phantom Years. Fedorow's well-known epic, the Shahnameh. Fedorow's well-known epic, the Shahnameh, written around 1010 AD, ends with the last Persian king, Yazdarig III, who died in 651 AD. The epic tells nothing about the Islamic conquest of Persia and has no allusions to Islam at all. It simply skips 300 years of Islamic influence as if they had never existed. Moreover, the Parsis, the Zarathustra worshippers in India, have been debating their own chronology furiously since the messengers from Iran in the 18th century told them that they made a mistake in counting the years since their flight from the homeland. This claim evidence, however, has been withdrawn. Even modern encyclopedias vary in their assertions between the 7th and 10th century for the event. A thorough examination of the architecture of the Umayyads, they were the famous First Arabic dynasty from 661 AD until 750 AD, detects untypical characteristics for an Islamic dynasty. These unusual characteristics are especially visible in their palaces. We see a painting approximately 725 AD on a wall, in spite of the Islamic prohibition against portraying human figures, by the way, showing the Persian king Khosrow II paying homage to the Umayyadi sovereign. But by then, this Persian king had been dead for approximately 100 years. The introduction of Arabic coins, organized by the Caliph Abd al-Malik in 695 AD, reveals some remarkable contradictions. The Arabic coins bear the portrait of the Persian king Khosrow II, who had died a long time before. Manfred Zeller draws the following conclusion from this and other facts. We have to eliminate 2 phantom times. The first of approximately 78 years from 583 AD until 661 AD, and a second one of approximately 218 years from 750 until 968. The first phantom time came into being through artificial separation of the Persian and Umayyadi history, which in reality was contemporaneous. Thus, Zeller explains the contradictions of the un-Islamic style and the late appearance of Khosrow II in the Umayyadi history. The second phantom time is a time-stretching repetition of the Persian history from 528 AD until 661, now in Islamic style and dated from 750 until 968. Harun al-Rashid is an invention, as is the whole history of his dynasty. Probably Islam did not spread until about 10 centuries ago. Now, this is the kind of stuff that is fascinating, because what we've seen just right here in this little paragraph, he's only, he's making the claim about 300 years have been added, which is fine, which goes along with the paper. But the way they were added are important to pay attention to. Right, so the first thing we have here is we have some time stretching going on. We have dynasties lasting way longer than they ever should have, or a king lasting way longer than they should have. This is probably why we find that people back in the day lived like 1,000 years, right? The Bible's a good offender on this one. It's not that these people were living that long, it's that the history of those people, if they existed, has been stretched over time, right? Like everything has been jumbled up, stretched to fit into years, etc. We find this all over history, and it's all over. It doesn't matter. I'm not just, it's not just the Bible that's an offender. It's so many things that are an offender. A lot of mainstream stuff, when you really start to look into things, you'll find that a certain king will have lived too long, and then suddenly they'll split it in half and be like, oh, it was his son, when there's no proof that his son took over, for example. We'll go into that way later. That's not here either. Anyway, the other thing is that some of these things are just copied, right? Some of these events are just duplicated, right? And that's the other problem, right? We either they're duplicated by the mainstream now to kind of make things flow, like making up a brand new son to a king with the same name, or they're just duplicated and nobody pays attention to it. Everybody thinks that the duplication isn't a duplication. They just think that it just fits into history, no problem. Those are two really important things to remember when we're studying this stuff, and they're all over. For those of you who are really still skeptical, the reality is these two things are probably the easiest thing to find when you study chronology. You look for those patterns. People living way too long, and duplications of events. Those are major things. All right, no. Keep going. While this way some riddles and research problems can be solved, others will follow. For instance, the miraculous origin of Islam. It is generally known that historians are astonished by this quote-unquote miracle. We can read this in the introduction of Fisher Welch's Geschichte, Volume 1, Der Islam 1. Birth and success of Islam seem to be a miracle. A miracle like that is needed for an explanation. This is known to all scientists. Gunter Lulling has suggested a new scenario. The history of the Jews shows centuries of darkness and discontinuity that support the thesis of the phantom time. One of the important modern works on Jewish history bears the descriptive title, The Dark Ages, Jews in Christian Europe, between 711 through 1096. Here are two quotations. It seemed that they, the Jews, totally disappeared together with the breakdown of the Roman Empire. However, we don't find any evidence of their presence until the Carolingian period. For the Carolingian period, historians find only written sources, whereas material sources like buildings and artifacts exist just for the time after 1000 AD. The Jewish quarter in Rosenberg between 1006 and 1028 AD, and in Cologne between 1056 and 1075 AD, in Worms around 1080 AD, in the Speyer around 1084 AD, etc. And for the regions outside Germany, we are told, of course we know from inscriptions and other sources about Jewish societies and single persons in nearly all provinces of the Roman Empire, and we can reasonably suppose, with or without proof, that there is in fact no district without Jews. Nevertheless, there doesn't exist any evidence and only little probability that a substantial number of Jews lived anywhere in the Western world at this time. For those of you listening, there is a picture of a graph that they've made. I highly recommend just stopping for a second, taking a look at it. Kind of gives you a visual of what we're going over. Anyway, how can we find support in archaeological research for our phantom time? In 1986, a conference of archaeologists specializing in medieval towns took place under the heading, "The Rebirth of Towns in the West, AD to 1050. The participants discussed a puzzling problem. Does continuity in the evolution of the town, postulated by historians, exist or not? The archaeologists could prove that the stratigraphies of towns, adapted to normal quote-unquote chronology, inevitably involve gaps. Where was continuity? Generally, it is enigmatic to archaeologists if towns in the Middle Ages had had an economic sense or function. Historians and archaeologists must maintain that no civil town building existed in this period, and that only church buildings survived from that time. To justify this, they must assert that at that time, towns were not central marketplaces. So basically, it was just only religious, and that's it. That's all it could possibly be, because that's the main problem, right? With the Dark Ages is that we do not have the evidence of like actual living quarters for people in this missing time frame. Like, that's one of the big problems. We have churches here and there, and that's fine, but we do not have towns. We do not have any of these archaeological structures that should exist if the chronology that mainstream is touting here is real. Like, it's just not there. The few existing stratigraphies of German towns give evidence of the phantom time. In Frankfurt am Main, archaeological excavations did not find any layer for the period between 650 and 910 AD. Nevertheless, it has been assumed that something had been found in order to avoid empty centuries, which is inconceivable. Thus, the absent period was construed by layers, composed of waste and ceramic fragments from other locations, which were spread to fill the gap and support known chronology. I mean, I don't know what else to say. We're coming up on time here, so I'm going to call it, but that's the perfect place to stop it. I mean, look what archaeologists are doing. This is a scientific fact. Archaeologists take artifacts from other locations, of which they are just assuming are from a certain period of time, by the way, using horrible dating methods, and then they just transpose them on other areas where they assume that you should have found these things. And of course, they never found anything, so they have to do this. This is not how you do science. This is not how you do archaeology, but this is how the mainstream does archaeology. Now, for those of you out there who still don't want to believe that you've been hoodwinked, man, you've been lied to. Let's be honest, you are being lied to straight to your face. Even worse, you are being made to take those lies, take them as fact, and then spread them further. Even worse than that, you are supposed to take those lies, put them into your life, and then if anybody questions those lies, you get to disassociate yourself from those people. You can shame those people, and it will be socially acceptable. You want to know one of the reasons why society right now has so many problems? It's because of ideologies like this. And that's what this is at this point, right? I mean, this is an academic ideology. And it's absolutely poisonous to everything that we should be doing as a society. So while we are just dealing with something you might think doesn't matter, oh, it's just some years added to our history, whatever, think about the kinds of ideologies these lies are creating. All right, and it's not just, it's not just the Dark Ages problem that we're trying to deal with here that has created a lot of problems. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff in history, and all of this adds up. I mean, when we have people being expelled for trying to do real science, when we have people being ostracized for trying to question history, that is not That is not how you do history. That is not how you do science. You question these things all the time. The very second you feel you think you have a strong grasp on something that's historical or scientific, you stop and you question it and you try to look at it objectively. There's no other way to approach it. There is no arguing here. If you believe in the Dark Ages, you have to explain why it is okay for these institutions, these mainstream institutions, to literally lie. You have to explain it. And so I can't wait to hear it. Anybody who thinks that these aren't, anybody who thinks that the Dark Ages doesn't exist, you have to explain why it's okay for the mainstream to lie in their archaeology. All right, we'll call it here. So I'll continue on with this paper in the next segment, and stick around for it, especially if you are still skeptical of the whole Dark Ages situation, because this paper was written from a mainstream perspective. This is from an academic source. So this brings up another problem that anybody who strictly buys into the mainstream academic sources is, which mainstream source is the right source? Do you trust only the source that has the most people behind it, that has the most popularity behind it, that has the most people with paper degrees behind it? Or do you trust the source that is questioning the history using science, but is being ignored? Which one is right? Just from a mainstream academic point of view, because you do not have to be some sort of crazy conspiracist historian to notice that there is a huge problem with our history in phantom time. So, do you only listen to that popular source? Does popularity equal fact? Does it? I only say this to give a point of view that you may not be used to looking at yourself through. Right? Even in mainstream academia, there are some serious problems that people, fight about, for example, with the Dark Ages. And that's why we're reading this paper. So if you've never looked at another point of view with respect to history, and you have only listened to whatever the curriculum basically was for your studies, is that real science? Is that truth? Is that how you're supposed to gain truth? And the answer is, of course, no. That is not where truth comes from. Popularity does not equal truth, right? Yeah, all right, okay, we're done. I'm done. All right, we'll continue going on with this. I keep blabbing. All right.